They erased 2 of the Emperor's sons, not from history, from memory itself. I know because I found the seams where the erasure happened, and the seams don't line up. My name is Corvin Sale, and I am a data archivist, 3rd grade, attached to the Ordo Hereticus sub-branch of the Adeptus Administratum, Hive Primus, Scintilla. I have served for 22 years. I know how records die. I know how they are killed. And I know the difference. This is how I learned that the Emperor's 2 lost sons were not merely erased, they were unmade. And I know now why no one is permitted to ask why. I came to archival work the way most do, through aptitude rather than ambition. The Administratum tested me at 12, found my pattern recognition above threshold, my tolerance for isolation within acceptable parameters, my faith unimpeachable. They took me from my hab block on a Tuesday. My mother made the sign of the Aquila as I left. I made it back at her. I believed everything I was supposed to believe. I want you to understand that. Not with the defensive insistence of a man who has since stopped believing, but as a straightforward statement of fact. I believed the Emperor watched over humanity from his golden throne. I believed the Primarchs were his perfect sons, the greatest warriors ever made. I believed the Imperium, for all its weight and cruelty, was the wall between humanity and extinction. When I processed records that contained deaths, I processed them as necessities. When I encountered redactions, I understood them as prudence. When I found gaps, I filled them with the assumption of good reason. The archive at Hive Primus, Scintilla ran at 14 degrees, cold enough to preserve parchment, cold enough that in the first years, my fingers would numb around the stylus before I learned to wrap them. The smell was dust and wax seals, and the faint chemical rot of old inks, slowly surrendering to entropy. I grew to love that smell. It meant age. It meant permanence. It meant the Imperium endured. I had access, eventually, to the pre-heresy consolidated indices, not the documents themselves, not at my clearance level, but the indices, the catalogues of what existed, where it was stored, what it referenced. An archivist who can read an index the way a navigator reads the stars can learn extraordinary things. The index is the skeleton, the documents are flesh, but the skeleton tells you where the bones were broken. I want you to understand what a pre-heresy consolidated index contains. Every legion is listed, every Primarch, every documented engagement, every gene seed tithe, every supply manifest, every communication abstract. The legions of Astartes were the greatest military instruments in human history, and the administratum of that era was nothing if not thorough. Every bottle of promethium, every bolter casing, every gene seed culture is logged somewhere in the chain that feeds back to the master index. There are 20 slots in the Primarch matrix. 18 are full, not 20. Not 20, with 2 marked deceased or traitor or sanctioned. 20, with 18 filled, and 2 gaps that are not gaps at all, because gaps imply empty space. These are scars. I did not understand that the first time I found them. I recorded an anomaly flag, as protocol required. I assumed data loss as protocol suggested. I filed the flag and went home. Those were the last hours I would spend in genuine innocence, though I would not know it for another 3 years. The second encounter was not during sanctioned archival hours. This is important because it tells you the shape of my obsession. I want you to understand. I was not conducting an investigation. I had no suspicion, no theory, no framework. I had a pattern recognition apparatus that had been trained for 20 years, and it had flagged something in my index scan that my conscious mind had not yet processed. I returned to the archive at the 6th hour past the midnight bell, because I could not sleep, and I could not stop thinking about the shape of the thing, without being able to say what the shape was. The archive night staff nodded at me without surprise. Archivists returning at odd hours were not unusual. The obsessive relationship between an archivist and their materials is a known occupational condition. They left me to my work. I pulled the Primarch matrix index again, on a fresh data slate, making no reference to my previous scan. I wanted clean eyes, The 2 gaps in the 20-slot matrix were not listed as gaps. That was the first thing. They were not entries reading redacted or expunged or restricted. They were not listed at all. The index counted 18 entries, numbered 1 through 20, with 2 numbers absent from the sequence. And the count at the bottom said 18, as if 18 and 20 were equivalent when you removed 2 numbers from the middle. I counted the list 4 times. I am trained to count such things. The numbers ran I2 skip, 3 IVVC78, INIT XXLN skip, 12, 13, 14, XVIS 16, 18, 18, XXXX, 18 Primarchs. 2 absent, not absent as in missing. Absent as in the index itself had been taught not to feel the missing weight, but the index cross-references were still there, broken links. A supply manifest from the late Crusade era that referenced a legion designation that no longer appeared in the index. An equipment tithe from the war moons of Ulanor that listed materiel allocated to a fighting force whose designation matched no legion in the current record. 17 of these I found that night. 17 threads leading back to 2 holes in the fabric that someone had been very careful to make smooth. The formatting was wrong. That was the detail I kept returning to, the detail my pattern recognition had flagged without my conscious awareness. When a record is organically incomplete, the gaps have a natural look. Worn edges, inconsistent spacing, the evidence of entropy. When a record is deliberately edited, there is a flatness to the absence, a too neat quality, a smoothness that nature does not produce. Nature leaves ragged holes. Bureaucracy leaves surgical excisions. Someone had not merely removed records from the pre-ERASED consolidated indices. They had gone back through all cross-references and excised those too, and then adjusted the indices to count without the missing numbers, and done it so thoroughly that the only remaining evidence was 17 orphaned cross-references too small and specific to be worth chasing, and a formatting consistency that was too perfect, too smooth, too flat. I sat in the cold archive until 2 hours before the morning bell, staring at the smooth places where 2 of the Emperor's sons had once existed, and I tried to remember a time in my education when anyone had mentioned the missing legions, and I realized that I could not as forbidden knowledge, not as cautionary example, simply not at all. I was 34 years old and possessed of an excellent education in imperial history, and the concept of missing Primarchs had never once entered my awareness as a concept to be had. That smoothness was not just in the index, it was in me. I went home as the morning workers began their shifts, and I did not sleep, and I did not even then tell anyone what I had found. I want to describe how an archivist investigates something they are not supposed to be investigating, because the method matters. You cannot request documents that officially do not exist. You cannot cross-reference records that are too sensitive for your clearance. You cannot simply submit a formal inquiry to the relevant authority, asking why 2 of the Emperor's sons appear to have been deleted from history. What you can do is pull every document that your clearance permits on topics adjacent to the gap and build a picture of the negative space from what surrounds it. I spent 14 months doing this. I want you to understand that. 14 months of authorized archival research, none of it exceeding my clearance parameters, none of it technically in violation of any protocol. I was leading a picture of 2 absences out of every document that touched their edges. What I found was not what I expected to find. I expected, if I expected anything, evidence of disgrace. Primarchs who had failed their duties, who had turned to chaos, who had been destroyed by the Emperor in his wisdom and erased as cautionary examples too dangerous to preserve. This would have been frightening in its implications, but comprehensible in its logic. You do not preserve the memory of catastrophic failure. You excise it. The Imperium does this with planets. It seemed consistent that it would do it with individuals. Instead, I found supply chains with no terminus. A Munitorum logistics record from the 43rd year of the Great Crusade detailed the ongoing resupply of combat forces. The record was thorough in the way Munitorum records always are. Quantities of bolter shells, promethium canisters, Medicae supplies, replacement power armor components, all allocated to specific recipients. Most recipients were named legions with clear designations. 2 recipients had designations that appeared nowhere in the current Primarch matrix, and the quantities allocated to them were not small. They were enormous. Combat scale. Decades of ongoing resupply to forces that had not, according to the current historical record, existed. If the missing legions had been small, isolated, quickly destroyed or disgraced, the logistics record might show a brief spike and then nothing. Instead, it showed 43 years of sustained resupply, consistent with active large-scale military operations. 43 years. Some estimates I could work backward to suggest figures of 100,000 Astartes or more. Not disgraced failed experiments. Major fighting forces, present for the greater part of the Great Crusade, receiving resources on a scale comparable to the most celebrated legions of the era. They had been erased not because they were small and failed. They had been erased despite being large and present. I sat with that for several days. I kept returning to my work, filing my authorized records, cross-referencing my approved indices. The cold of the archive had long since stopped bothering me. I had learned to work with numb fingers. I want to be precise about when my investigation changed in nature. For 14 months, I had been doing what I thought of as passive archival observation, noticing what my authorized work revealed. But the logistics record was too significant to file away as an anomaly and move on. I began to pull adjacent records with more intention, not falsifying access, not exceeding my clearance, but using every authorized query pathway available to me with a specific destination in mind. Over the following 6 months, I found 8 more records of the same type: tactical deployment summaries, gene seed tithe records, officer commendation archives. The size and scope of the 2 absent legions became clearer with each one. What emerged was not the silhouette of 2 embarrassments, but the silhouette of 2 armies, 2 legions comparable in scale and accomplishment to the Lunar Wolves or the Ultramarines or the Imperial Fists, present at major campaigns, receiving high honors, contributing to the Great Crusade on a level that should have made their names bywords in Imperial history. And then, at a point I could roughly date to late in the Great Crusade, and before the heresy, they stopped appearing in any record at all. Not a gradual decline, not a tapering off, a clean line. Before the line, abundant evidence of 2 major legions. After the line, nothing. Not even the orphaned cross-references I had found in the Master Index. Those had survived because they were too obscure to catch. Everything closer to the surface had been taken. The Klee and line was not a date of disgrace. It was a date of surgical removal, and the surgery had been extremely thorough. I was not frightened yet. I want you to believe that. I was an archivist investigating an archival anomaly. I was doing my job with professional diligence. The scale and deliberateness of what I was finding was remarkable, but remarkable findings were not inherently threatening. I had found evidence of deliberate historical revision on a massive scale. This was concerning. It was not yet personal. That would come later. I first spoke to another person about what I had found in the 18th month of my investigation. The choice of confidant was both deliberate and reluctant. Adept Mir Vossel had been senior to me in the archive for 11 years. She was 61, had survived 3 departmental purges through a combination of political invisibility and genuinely exceptional competence, and possessed access clearances 2 grades above my own. She was also, I had long believed, something beyond a routine true believer, not a heretic, not a cynic, something more precise. A woman who had been in the archive long enough to understand that what was written in official records and what had happened were related but not equivalent, and who had made her peace with this distinction through the simple discipline of never caring about anything that was not in her immediate professional purview. I chose her because I needed higher clearances and because I believed she would not panic. I was mostly right. I laid out what I had found over the course of 2 evenings, in the archive, after the rest of the staff had departed, both of us drinking cooled recaf from her personal canteen. Her face did not change much as I spoke. She had the archivist's discipline of withholding visible reaction, of receiving information before processing it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You understand," she said, "that you found evidence of something above the Inquisition's interest." "I found evidence of historical revision," I said. "Those are the same thing." She put down her recaf. "The Inquisition doesn't revise history on this scale. The Inquisition burns records on this scale. What you're describing is a purge that left the document skeleton intact and removed only the flesh. That's different. That requires different access, different authority." "How different?" She looked at me for a moment. "High enough that investigating it is not something you can survive." "I'm not sure I can stop now," I said. Not bravely, simply as a fact. She was quiet again. Then, "Show me the logistics records." She spent 4 hours reviewing everything I had assembled. She used her higher clearances to access 2 adjacent records I could not have reached, reading them in silence while I waited. I watched her face. Twice, something moved behind her eyes. Once her jaw tightened briefly and then released. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the archive for a long time. "They weren't removed because they failed," she said. "No," I agreed. "They were removed because knowing what happened to them would raise questions about the Emperor's judgment that the Imperium cannot afford to have raised." She said it very quietly, as if testing the words for structural integrity. "Not heresy, not corruption. Something that happened during the Great Crusade, at the height of the Emperor's power, with his full awareness, that was then decided to be too dangerous for humanity to remember." "I think that's the shape of it," I said. She was quiet for a long time. The archive hummed around us, cold and patient. "The question," she said at last, "is whether you're the kind of fool who needs to know what it was, or whether you're the kind of fool who can live with knowing the shape of the whole." I already knew the answer. I think she did too. What I found next I want to describe with precision, because imprecision here would be dishonest, and this record is intended as evidence, not theater. Adept Vossel's access clearances permitted her to query the Consolidation Archive, a repository of pre-heresy documents gathered during the scouring for preservation and assessment. Most of its contents had been transferred to higher security facilities on Terra. What remained on Scintilla were the documents judged too low in sensitivity to be worth moving, but too high in sensitivity to be publicly accessible. A vast middle category. Millions of records. An archivist could work there for a decade and barely scratch the surface. We were not the first archivists to investigate what we were investigating. I want to be clear about that, because it is important for understanding what we found. 3 previous inquiries, conducted by archivists whose names appeared in the administrative logs, had followed similar pathways through similar evidence. All 3 had ended. 2 with voluntary transfer requests to postings that no longer appeared in the current staff register. 1 with a death notation, natural causes, sudden onset, 38 years old. The administrative logs that recorded these 3 prior investigations were not redacted. They were simply filed in a location that required Vossel's clearance to access, in a category labeled Concluded Inquiries, with no further classification marker. Someone had left them findable for an archivist with the right clearances and the right patience. Whether this was accident or intent, I cannot say. Whether it was a warning or a trap or simply bureaucratic carelessness, I cannot say. What I can say is what the 3rd inquirer had found before he died of natural causes at 30 to 8 years old. His notation, a single page, read, "Found evidence suggesting both absent Primarchs were removed, not following disgrace or treachery, but following resolution of a situation the Emperor wished expunged from the Legion's collective memory and his own. Evidence points toward a command-level decision to make the relevant events and persons effectively non-historical. The thoroughness of the removal suggests this was not conducted by any single authority, but required cooperation across multiple branches, including elements within the Legiones, Astartes themselves. The surviving brothers killed their siblings' history, I don't know why, but I know they were told to. Then the notation ended. I read it 3 times. The archive hummed around me. The cold was permanent in my fingers, and I had given up trying to warm them years ago. The surviving brothers killed their siblings' history. 20 Primarchs, 18 who remained in the record. And at some point in the Great Crusade, those 18 had participated, willingly or under orders or both, in the erasure of 2 of their own brothers from human memory. Not after a betrayal. Before the heresy. Before the galaxy burned. During the years when the Emperor still walked, still led, still shaped humanity's destiny with his own hands. He had asked his sons to forget 2 of their brothers. And they had obeyed. And then somehow that obedience had itself been buried, so that future generations would not only lack the memory of the 2 absent Primarchs, but would lack even the knowledge that they had once been remembered, and then been made to forget. The smoothness in the index, the smoothness in me. It was not a gap in the record. It was a wound that had been allowed to heal over completely, leaving skin where the flesh had been, no scar visible from the outside, because the scar had been smoothed away along with everything else. I want to describe the moment I understood this fully, because it is the moment this story becomes personal rather than professional. I was sitting in the archive, in the cold, at 2 hours past the midnight bell, with the third archivist's 1-page notation on the data slate in my hands, and I thought about my own education, the thorough education the administrator had provided me. The Imperial history courses, the Primarch liturgies, the names spoken in prayer, the images in the chapel, the 18 heroic faces in the fresco above the altar in the Hive Primus Cathedral of St. Margrave. 18 faces. I had grown up praying before 18 faces, and never once thought to count them, never once thought to ask whether they were all there were, never once thought to wonder whether I was kneeling before a commissioned devotional or a curated lie. My faith in the Emperor had been built in part on ground that had been deliberately prepared to make certain questions unthinkable, not forbidden, not suppressed, simply unthinkable. I had not been told there were no missing Primarchs. I had been given a world in which the concept had no surface to land on. I am a man who was shaped by an erasure so thorough it shaped him without his knowledge. And I want you to understand that this is not merely a matter of historical curiosity. I want you to understand that every person who has prayed before a Primarch fresco, every Astartes who carries his legion's genetic inheritance, every scholar who has studied the Great Crusade, every child who has learned the names of the Emperor's sons has been shaped by the same erasure, and none of them know it. None of us know it. We were given the smooth skin and taught to mistake it for the original. I requested a meeting with Vossel the following morning and found her office empty. Her personal effects were present. Her work. Logs were open on her desk, mid-entry. Her recaf canteen was still warm. She did not return to the archive. Her personnel file noted a transfer request, filed the previous evening, to a posting on Fenris 1, verified did not exist in the current staff register. The transfer request had been authorized in 11 minutes, at the 47th minute past the midnight bell, by an authority whose designation I did not recognize. I want to be precise about this timeline. The authorization of her transfer occurred after I read the third archivist's notation, after I had understood the scope of what we had found, after I had, without speaking to Vossel, reached a conclusion that she had apparently also reached independently. 11 minutes. Someone had known within 11 minutes that we had found the notation. The archive had been watched. Perhaps it had always been watched. Perhaps the Consolidation Archive, with its mid-sensitivity orphaned documents and its 3 prior concluded inquiries, was a constructed space, a repository of enough evidence to tempt an investigator to the final conclusion, monitored carefully so that anyone who reached that conclusion could be transferred. I am using Vossel's word. She would have approved of the bureaucratic precision. I stayed at my desk that morning and did my work. I filed my authorized records. I cross-referenced my approved indices. I did not run. I want you to understand why. Not because I was brave. Because I had understood something that had drained the urgency from flight. If the archive was watched, I had already been seen. If someone had known within 11 minutes of my reading the notation, then my movements and access logs were already in someone's hands. Running would accomplish nothing except confirming a guilt I had not yet been charged with. And more than that, I had spent 22 years building a record of loyalty and competence and genuine belief. If I ran, I abandoned that record and became simply a frightened man with dangerous knowledge. If I stayed, I was still an archivist who had conducted authorized research and found anomalies that he had documented and would be prepared to discuss professionally. This was not a plan for survival. I was not naive enough for that. It was a decision about the kind of death I was willing to have, the kind that ran, versus the kind that stayed and spoke clearly. I had, over the previous night, committed my findings to a secondary record, encoded in an archival notation system that I had developed over 20 years of working alone, that I reasonably believed no automated decryption would catch. I am not telling you where that record is. If you are reading this, you have already found it, and my trust in your finding it is itself the answer. The Inquisitor arrived at the archive at the 44th minute past the 3rd hour of the afternoon. She was younger than I expected. Not young, but younger than the exhausted ancient I had imagined. Perhaps 50, short hair the color of old metal, augmetic lens in her left eye. She came alone, without retinue, and dismissed the afternoon staff with a clearance code that sent them to the lower levels without question. She sat down across from my desk and looked at me for a moment without speaking. Her augmetic lens made a small adjustment, a focusing sound, a grinding of servo motors. "You found the notation," she said. "Not a question. I found a number of things over approximately 20 months of authorized archival research," I said. "You found the notation." Her voice was flat in a way I recognized, not the flatness of cruelty, the flatness of someone who has been having this conversation, in one form or another, for a very long time. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment, her left hand rested on the desk. I watched it. It was completely still, the hand of someone who has spent decades making it still. "You understand," she said, "that I'm not here because you committed heresy. You didn't commit heresy. Your research was authorized. Your findings were the predictable result of a competent archivist doing their job well. You understand that." "I understand it," I said. "I'm here because what you found cannot be in circulation, not because it's false, because it's true, and the truth of it would raise questions that the Imperium is not equipped to survive asking." She paused. Her left hand moved, a small adjustment, deliberate, then still again. "There are always 3 or 4 archivists per century who find the shape of this. Most are transferred. A few find the notation itself. Those we have this conversation with. What happens after this conversation?" She looked at me for a long moment. Her augmetic lens whirred again. Something moved in her organic eye briefly, and then was gone. "That depends," she said, "on whether you're willing to be the kind of person who carries dangerous knowledge quietly, or the kind who requires it to mean something by speaking it." I thought about Vossel, transferred at the 47th minute past the midnight bell. I thought about the 3rd archivist's 1-page notation and natural causes at 38. I thought about my mother making the Aquila at the door of our hab block, her faith in its protection absolute and unexamined, as mine had been until 20 months ago. "I've already made a secondary record," I said. She was not surprised. Her left hand moved again. "I know," she said. "I'm choosing not to ask where it is. That's not permission. It's practicality. You're an archivist. Of course you made a secondary record. Finding and destroying it would cost more than the information is worth, given that you're owing to keep the knowledge in your head regardless." She paused. "But the secondary record must be the end of it. No contacts, no transmission, no attempt to verify or expand. The record exists. Let it be enough." "Tell me why," I said. "Not why the secret is kept. I've worked that out. Tell me why they were erased. What happened to them?" Her left hand was still for a long time. "I don't know," she said. The flatness of her voice shifted slightly. "Something beneath it. I genuinely don't know. My access is sufficient to know the erasure exists and to manage people who find its edges. It is not sufficient to know the reason. That's above my level. When she spoke, it was with the particular precision of someone choosing exactly how many words to use. Someone knows. Somewhere on Terra, in the deepest strata of the highest clearance archives, the reason is written down. The Emperor knew. Some of his sons knew, and they took it with them into whatever form they now occupy. Dead, trapped, transformed. And someone in the present administration of the Imperium knows, because the monitoring apparatus that sent me here is not automated. Someone is still watching these archives with human attention. Someone reads the logs. Someone authorized Vossel's transfer in 11 minutes at the midnight bell. She looked at me, but that person is not me, and finding them would require a path I cannot help you walk. I thought about the 17,000 execution records I had not processed in this life, because I was an archivist rather than an administratum clerk, but that some version of me in another life could have processed without question. I thought about the shape of belief when it is built on ground prepared by careful hands for that specific purpose. I thought about the 18 faces in the fresco above the altar, and the 2 faces T had never been there, and the fact that I had spent 22 years praying in front of that fresco and never once felt their absence. What do you do? I asked her, with knowledge that the Emperor deliberately unmade 2 of his sons and then unmade the memory of the unmaking. And you can't know why. This time the organic eye didn't move at all. You work, she said. You pray if it still helps. You maintain what can be maintained, and you accept that the foundation of the Imperium is not truth. It is order. And order and truth are not always compatible. And someone, somewhere, decided 10,000 years ago that when they conflict, truth loses every time, without exception. She stood, straightened her coat. Her left hand was completely still. You'll receive a commendation for exceptional archival diligence at the end of this quarter, she said. The commendation is genuine. Your research was exceptional. The record, I will file notes that your inquiry was reviewed, found to be authorized archival activity, and closed without findings of concern. You will continue your work. Your pay grade will not change. Your access clearances will not change. She paused. Nothing will change. That's the arrangement. The 2 absent Primarchs, she said quietly to the door rather than to me. Whatever happened to them, it happened at the Emperor's command. That's the only certainty we have, which means the Emperor judged it necessary to unmake not just them, but any record of why. Whatever they were, whatever they did, or whatever was done to them, he decided humanity could not know. A pause. I have spent 30 years deciding whether that judgment was right. I've never reached a conclusion I could keep. She left. The archive hummed around me in the sea. Old. 14 degrees. Cold enough to preserve parchment. Cold enough to preserve records. I filed my authorized records for the remainder of the day. I cross-referenced my approved indices. I ate my evening meal in the archive canteen, alone, as I had most evenings for 2 years. The fresco in the Hive Primus Cathedral, which I passed on my route home, showed 18 faces in the firelight, serene and perfect. And I looked at the empty space on either side of them, that no one else walking past could see. And I made the sign of the Aquila out of habit. And then I stopped, before I finished the gesture, and stood in the cold street for a moment, thinking about what it meant to make a gesture of faith to a figure who had commanded his sons to unmake their brothers, and then unmake the unmaking, and whose reasons no one living was permitted to know. I finished the gesture. I walked home. I am still an archivist. I still believe the Imperium is a wall between humanity and extinction. I still believe the Emperor's will operates in ways beyond my comprehension. I still make the sign of the Aquila. These beliefs have not left me, but they are built now on knowledge of their own foundations, and the foundations are not what I was given to understand. They are something stranger and colder and more deliberate. I filed this record with a notation system I developed over 22 years of working alone. I am not a brave man. I am a thorough one. The distinction has saved and doomed me in equal measure. Somewhere on Terra, in the deepest strata of the highest clearance archives, the reason is written down. Someone knows what the Emperor unmade and why he made the unmaking untouchable. I hope they carry it